And she said nothing wrong with it.
Channel 114. Visitry. Channel 114.
One scratch card, 3 games, 16 chances to win. Win with a top prize of $125,000. Unbelievable but true. It's the new $10 scratch game. $125,000 jackpot. Loaded with lots of cash prizes. $100, $1,000, $10,000, and $125,000. Get your ticket from any lotto agent or scratch runner. $125,000 jackpot. There's cash to catch with just a scratch.
Good evening and welcome to this evening's edition of Roundtable Talk. Once again, we are pleased to welcome the Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Simone Keyser Beach, and Infectious Disease Specialist, Dr. Gerald Thompson, who is also a member of the local COVID-19 task force here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's been a very busy 2 weeks. I think 2 weeks would have been the last time you guys were here with us. Where are we today? What's happening? What's the latest?
Okay, thanks again for having us. As you said, it's been very busy. Things in COVID land move quickly and change quite a bit. So as of today, we have had 56 COVID positive cases. We just confirmed 1 new case, and that's from someone who came in on the AA945 flight that came out of Miami on Saturday, August 1st. And so we've gone up to 56 total cases. We had 1 recovery, and so it's still balanced out, 56 cases, 46 recovered, and 10 active cases. So that's
where we are right now. What has been the greatest challenge or challenges that you've had to face over the last 2 weeks?
Because of the rapidly changing situation in the US, that required that we change protocols pretty quickly. And the need to adjust to that and to have persons understand and comply has been the greatest challenge, I think. Because you might plan your trip 3 weeks out, and within that 3-week period, the protocol might change. So that, I think, has been the greatest challenge, but I think we have had quite a bit of success, if we term success as meeting the goals in terms of controlled quarantine. So we know exactly where persons are, decreasing the risk of exposure to the general public.
We could probably talk some about those successes, but Doc, you...
If I could say something on that note, because I've always found that some people get alarmed when hearing about 56 cases. But what is really taking place is that we know with almost every flight that comes in, there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 plus cases. And by what is the strength here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a great strength that I really must applaud, is the whole contact tracing, early detection that's able to get these individuals properly tested, diagnosed, and placing them under some measure of quarantine. And when you hear 56, some people thinking there's 56 cases around the place active. One, the vast majority of them have recovered. And it's sad that we don't emphasize that. And then I think we've had some discussions when we have new cases, to say 2 new cases. We say 2 new cases in relation to a flight, and they're all contained and controlled. When we say 2 new cases, people think, well, where is it? It could be anywhere. And there's a significant level still of fear that comes with it. And I want to just assure the public, in my view, I think that there have been some very important measures put in place to safeguard what is taking place here in St. Vincent and Grenadines.
We want to talk about some of what those specific measures are.
Well, I mean, I could say, I think the task force, I mean, Simone is across the room from me. But, I mean, what Donna Bascom, what Dr. Duncan and his team have done. I mean, I've been out at the airport helping out in a small way. And I'm seeing what these folks are doing. They are our first line of defense. And along with the general policy coming from Prime Minister and Cabinet, I think we have something in place. But I want to say, too, that, first of all, the testing that we've done. First of all, the support of CARFA, and now St. Vincent has 5 machines, 5 testing machines, and we put 3 of them into play. Others, I'm sure, will be going into play in different locations, Grenadines, airport, whatever the case might be. But that has reinforced that whole process. And I think the most important thing, I say, that contact tracing ability, that ring of nurses and other health personnel around the country, in Chateaublay, in Fancy, in Greg's, in whatever, to really solve it, has created that health network so we could properly control the process. There are many other things, but I think those are the core issues and so in play, as well as, the various policies that have been put in place.
So you have been on the ground, you help out at the airport when the flights come in. What have been your observations of that process?
Well, I tell you, I as a physician, I am there really to help out on a voluntary basis. But, I'm usually there on the line, dealing with our Vincentians coming back home. And I could tell many of them could be a little upset. By having to do testing, sometimes it takes an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours to process everybody. And some people can get a little upset and angry, they want to leave and go out. The changes in policy, sometimes some persons don't quite understand, and so part of my role is to help in the process of them understanding why we are doing this and why it's important to protect the whole nation, even though they may go through a little bit of frustration and sacrifice because of the added requirements that are required, But I've found the vast majority of persons coming through accept what is going on. They're so happy to come back home. They're so happy to be back on, rather than, especially those who've come from the United States, who've come from areas where spikes are just going up all over the place. They're really happy to be back in a place that they feel much safer with respect to catching this COVID-19. And I think that's the real thing. I think the vast majority of people come. One or two do get a little upset because, of maybe having to pay for a hotel. Some may have a relative they want to see and hug straight away as soon as they go out, and we're instructing them they can't do that, and they say, why? I have a negative test. But they don't realize that they could have caught and picked up the COVID at the airport in Miami or
on
elsewhere.
their way to the airport.
They could have picked up on the plane if there's a positive case on the plane and they're sitting near to that person, and a number of these things. And so I think that by and large, the majority of them leave with a much better understanding of their role than when they first took the flight to come in. And they're all happy to be back home in St. Vincent. Whether it's 5 days or 14 days of quarantine, they're really happy to be back.
And have you noticed any differences in terms of the processing of the flights from Canada as against those from the United States?
Well, I think initially we were alarmed. First flight, 11 cases. The next flight, 4. Now we're seeing 1. And maybe that's because we are insisting that persons get tested before they get onto the flight. That's a critical measure. That means that persons ain't jumping onto the flight. And similarly in Canada, largely because they have, they don't have as many cases. Their curve has dipped significantly, but still they have cases. And we see a difference there, I imagine. Mm-hmm. And a difference from other countries of the world and so on.
Definitely.
Let's talk, we're now into phase 2.
Yes.
So what does that entail?
So phase 2 of the protocol for the entry of travelers into St. Vincent and Grenadines. Initially, we spoke about from August 1st that the bubble concept in terms of persons in certain countries, CARICOM countries identified, would be able to come into St. Vincent without having to have a test. You don't have to come with it, you don't have to have one done on arrival, and you would have no quarantine. However, between the time, and I'm not sure if you remember, but on that protocol, it said that we would use the period of July to the period of July to determine what we would do in August. It was going to depend on the number of cases we got from other Caribbean countries. It was going to depend on what was happening in those Caribbean countries in terms of COVID. And we determined that by the August 31st, you had some resurgence, and also you had some of these Caribbean countries opening their borders and accepting flights. So you might have a country accepting 2-3 flights from the USA in particular within a week, and that increases their baseline risk, and therefore we came to the conclusion that we would not be proceeding to that no tests, no quarantine for those CARICOM countries. Rather, we would ask them still to produce a PCR test, but we would give them 7 days. Instead of 5 days for those persons outside of the bubble, we would give these persons in those CARICOM countries 7 days to have a test done, and then you come with that test, or you have the test on arrival. And your quarantine would be based on where you're coming from and your own individual level of risk. So, for example, if you were a healthcare worker who might have been exposed, or if you were a sailor, somebody from an oil rig coming from a country that would determine your level of risk and therefore your quarantine requirements and any further testing. So we didn't go along the no tests, no quarantine route. We didn't think that was appropriate at this time.
But interestingly, Barbados has a CARICOM or Caribbean bubble, which includes St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Would this be reciprocal in any way?
If you notice, initially, Barbados had a larger bubble, and they also, and they changed too. And their change, I imagine, was because of the change in environment. So their much smaller bubble now includes Dominica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Kitts. That's it. And those countries, we don't have to have a PCR to go into Barbados. The idea of it being reciprocal would be, again, the 7 days. Barbados they have a different capacity in terms of quarantine capacity, testing capacity, and isolation capacity. And also, they are getting more flights. They get flights from the UK, they get flights from the US, even though they reduce the number of flights they get. And so their level of risk relative to our risk and our exposure in country requires that we maintain our the need for them to produce a PCR, but they would have a 7-day, and not that we will say you come without. Not at this time.
So let me just get it clear. A Barbadian can come with a PCR.
They can come with a PCR, which is 7 days old, or they will have a PCR on arrival.
On arrival.
Yes.
And a Vincentian going to Barbados?
Would not have to have a PCR done to go into Barbados for now.
Okay. Don't forget that you can send in your questions, comments, concerns on our Facebook page, and when we come back, we'll want to talk a little bit more about testing. Back in just a moment.
Channel 114. Channel 114.
One scratch card, 3 games, 16 chances to win. Win with a top prize of $125,000. Unbelievable but true. It's the new $10 scratch game. $125,000 jackpot. Loaded with lots of cash prizes. $100, $1,000, $10,000, and $125,000. Get your ticket from any lotto agent or scratch runner. $125,000 jackpot. There's cash to catch with just a scratch.
Welcome back. Just before the break, we were talking about the protocols that exist for entry into Barbados and vice versa. But what about the protocols for UK visitors, for instance, or from areas that are considered high risk?
Okay, so we have developed a draft classification in terms of risk. So the UK would be put into a medium risk category, United Kingdom, because we think that unlike the US, where you have this, especially coming out of Miami and some of the others, where it's still unstable, we have put the US into a high risk category, and we have put the UK along with other countries into a medium risk category. And the main difference here would be for the US, anybody coming from the United States of America or transiting through the United States of America will have to come with a PCR test, negative result, will have a test done on arrival, and must stay in a 5-day quarantine in a hotel paid for by themselves. You compare that with somebody coming out of the United Kingdom or somebody coming out of Canada, that person may come with a PCR result, or it will be done on arrival. When you come in on arrival, if you have a PCR result, you will not have a second test done unless it's determined by the Port Health staff that the test you are coming in with is not appropriate. And then you will be sent home to do your 48 hours quarantine. So that's a major difference in terms of you must have a test coming from the US, and you must stay in a 5-day hotel for quarantine. For the UK and Canada and other medium risk countries, you don't have to have a test as yet coming in, but one will be done on arrival, and you can quarantine at home.
Teresa, I wonder if I come here, because I think that is significant. There are some countries of the world, they may have gone through their trials with COVID, and their risk is now much lower. And you're seeing that we have a different protocol for them. But clearly, we're friends with the United States, they're allies and so, but it's not about that. Clearly, there are problems taking place in a number of states in the United States. Even though somebody's coming through New York, but they've come from a state coming through New York, that could still be a problem for St. Vincent. And so we must put those measures in place for high-risk areas, and we're hoping that people or persons coming from those high-risk areas understand that we have to reduce these risks and take these particular measures. Whereas in other cases, the UK and Canada, it's a much different perspective. And similarly, for the UK, we are allowed to get into the UK without the need to show testing. Yeah. Believe that. We don't have to show testing. Of course, passing through Barbados, there may be, is there a need for...
There's no need. No, as of now.
As of now. Mm-hmm. But coming from the UK into St. Vincent, unfortunately, you may have to show...
have to transit someplace.
Transiting to Barbados, you probably have to show some form of testing also, or they could insist that you go through some measure of quarantine.
Yeah.
There have been some other issues in respect of the quarantining process here. We know that lots of people have complained about the fact that they have to go into mandatory quarantine, and have also complained about the hotels. Did the government have anything to do at all with which hotel these people are being quarantined in? Did the government have a role, or was it the fact that these were the hotels or the businesses that responded to the ministry?
The government had a role in terms of ensuring that the hotels have the capacity to handle a case. As you recognize, a person who is under quarantine, you're under quarantine because the assumption is you have been exposed to COVID. And so you're not going to be dealing with that guests in the same way in which you would deal with somebody else who was not exposed, who is not under quarantine. And so in order to ensure that the guest is safe, that the staff is safe, and that the quarantine is maintained, we had to ensure that the facilities being used for quarantine sites, that the persons had some level of previous training in dealing with persons under quarantine, and they also had the setup which would allow for the control management of quarantine. So we set out certain requirements. You had to have individual rooms, individual bathrooms. You had to have some sort of underground security. You had to be able to be enclosed to allow for controlled access to the site. Additionally, we were working with the Tourism Authority and the Ministry of Tourism because they have established standards already, and that was extremely important. And we have also been working with the Hotel and Tourism Association and the Tourism Authority and the Ministry of Tourism in terms of heightening their training. We started training. We gave protocols very early on in terms of how hotels should deal with COVID and the risks to COVID. So we started that process quite a long time ago, and we've now increased it where we have signed up with the CAFA Hotel and Tourism, Health and Tourism program, and that has been even more intense training. So in that sense, the government, the Ministry of Health, the task force, along with the Ministry of Tourism and the Tourism Authority, partnered with the Hotel and Tourism Association to ensure that facilities that could safely implement hotel quarantine were selected.
So there's a certain amount of training involved.
Oh yes, definitely.
Okay. Are there some specific things that a hotel must, for instance, have in place?
So, for example, if you think about cleaning, they need to know how to clean a room after somebody has used it. You need to be aware of how you set up your reception area. Do you need to have a screen? Persons need to be aware of how you use a mask, the spacing, how you set out your dining room. You have to move from buffets to single service. All of those things have to be in place. Even what fluids you clean with, how do you clean from normally you clean from the dirty to the dirty to clean or clean to dirty, depends on what's happening. All of those are things that we had to go through a process of retraining or introducing the staff to things that were specific to COVID.
And you're satisfied that the participating hotels are, in fact,
Yes.
satisfying those requirements
Definitely.
at the current
Teresa, let me say, I think that it seems as if some persons, though, have been concerned more about the cost of the hotels. And that has been a little bit about it. Matter of fact, there's some person who still feel in the same way that person should be able to just walk off of a ship. They should be able to walk off of a plane because they've been sanctioned, that it's their right, and they should come home. But doing a little calculation, 150 passengers, because to discriminate and say who will pay, if government were to pay 150 passengers at the average rate, you're talking about maybe $240,000, $250,000 per flight. In a given month, you know,
$1 million.
you talk about $1 million. Now, I believe that the process that's been put in place, if there are some persons, there can be some arrangements made. But I think there has been the sheer enormity of this and the cost of being able to say, well, who wants a free hotel, you know what I mean, could get it free. And it's a very sensitive area that I would imagine there may be some persons, whether a student or whether they can return in, and so may not be able to pay. And I think some measures and so have
to be
been
put in place.
in place to actually deal with some of this, even though it requires maybe some paying back of funds and so forth or not. But I don't think that it could be an open process that anybody who wants free accommodation for a given specified period of time can do so. You know what I mean? I'm pretty sure that if somebody is very sick and has to be placed on isolation at the isolation center at Argyle, I'm not sure if there's going to be a cost in relation to that. I don't know if when, and otherwise, Simone, could you tell us a little about...
We could talk about that. We could talk a little bit about that because I think the comparison is being made with other islands where they're saying that the quarantine does not cost. For instance, I know in Grenada it comes at a cost. $1,700 for 14 days, and that does not include meals or anything of the sort. But someone has a question, and that question is Dr. Keza Beach. Some persons are of the opinion that the authorities are making up the rules as they go along. Can you please emphasize how fluid the COVID-19 pandemic is and the continuous cycle and challenges of planning, monitoring, evaluation, and re-evaluation to maintain a sense of normalcy as much as possible? I'm going to give you some time to mull over that, and we'll pick up that question when we come back after this break.
Channel 114. Channel 114.
One scratch card, 3 games, 16 chances to win. Win with a top prize of $125,000. Unbelievable but true. It's the new $10 scratch game. $125,000 jackpot. Loaded with lots of cash prizes. $100, $1,000, $10,000, and $125,000. Get your ticket from any lotto agent or scratch runner. $125,000 jackpot. There's cash to catch with just a scratch.
Welcome back, and of course, before we took the break, there was that question that you're going to start, Dr.
Okay. The question was about the fluidity and the apparent, what appears to some persons to be that we are just making them up.
And,
as everybody would realize by now that this is, as it's called, it's a novel virus, and the way in which we are learning each day Sometimes some people get so frustrated because you think you've understood something, and then in about 24 hours there's something completely different. So what we function as what we call a no regrets policy, which means that we want to minimize the chance of ill effects of this virus. And so we initially put in place a policy that we thought would be sufficient. And as with everything, you assess the outcomes, and where we determined there were deficiencies, we put new components into the policy to address that. And so this is something that you're going to see happening throughout this process. And as I said, at the end of each policy protocol document we develop, we always include that this can change, because you recognize that there are things that would, you might come up with something, you meet a problem, you need to address it. There's no sense in just, okay, that's the problem and we just leave it. That can't happen. We need to resolve. We would try to put in place the best possible solution, which would give the most reasonable, most rational solution to a problem. So we're going to expect more changes. We're going to expect that at the end of, maybe by the middle of this month, we might determine that it is actually best that everyone come with a test. That might be what is required, because as we are going forward, whereas when we started at the beginning of July, it was extremely difficult for someone to get a PCR done to come into St. Vincent. It's still difficult, but it's not as difficult. And what we're realizing, as Dr. Thompson said, when we started, we got 12 cases from the first flight. Now we're down to 1, because you are actually making it safer, making the possibility of somebody being positive on that flight much less. And so things will change with the aim of always improving and reducing the risk of infections.
This is a learning experience, sadly. I wish we could say we know everything about this virus, that we've had experience for 30, 40 years. That's not the case. There's so much the research that's been going on, the observational studies, and we are monitoring these things all the time. The science is constantly changing. And, I think that in general, communities dislike lockdowns, shutdowns, stress, and I tell you, observation, we wish that Vincentians were still washing their hands, were still practicing the social distancing, but they went through that period. And we would love them to still retain that, and we're going to constantly try to get them back to that. But we know it's going to be difficult. But the thing is that what we've observed, one, wearing masks help, and protecting them now in relation to persons coming into St. Vincent has been some of the 2 most critical things we've done. You know what I mean? At some stage, we may really have to step things back up again in terms of what we used to do, the supermarkets, what we get the bag, we know the lines, but we are appealing to Vincentians not to put those things aside. I mean, yes, you may see me sometimes without a mask, but I always have one nearby, Teresa, and everybody have your mask, your cloth mask, your surgical mask, this kind of nice fancy mask, have something, and I think it is going to help to protect you, because we find out that this may be a big factor. And at the same time too, right now, I wouldn't get onto a plane, you know what I mean? Especially I wouldn't get on, they won't let me on a plane without a mask. But my son in England is inviting me up and so forth. I said, I'm prefer video conferencing and seeing him on those measures and so.
Let's go back to the various types of testing again. I want to be a little more specific on the different types of tests. Who is going to take that one? The IgG and what is the difference?
So we have the IgG, IgM, that refers to antibody testing. And you remember that's what we used quite a bit earlier on, but we were very clear to say that would only tell you about exposure. So it's checking for antibodies. If you're exposed to a bacteria or a germ or so, the body responds by trying to fight it off by producing antibodies. So when we check for antibodies to this SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID, we are looking to see, was this person exposed? And there are two different types of antibodies we look for. The IgM, which says that this person has an active infection normally, and the IgG, which says you were exposed, but it was in the past. I have to be careful with that statement. The IgM says you have had recent exposure. So that's one test that we have used in the past in terms of exposure, mainly looking at contact tracing. And if we got somebody with a positive antibody test, especially an IgM, we would go on to the PCR, which is the swab that normally is a nasopharyngeal, so it goes up into the nose, into the back, or an oropharyngeal can be done, but it's less yield. And that is the definitive one, which would say this person has virus, is shedding the virus that causes COVID. The accuracy of the PCR test is very dependent on the sample taken. It's also dependent on the processing of it, so that you can have, in terms of accuracy, you can have a sensitivity of ranging between 86%, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. So sometimes it's not 100%, but it's supposedly much more accurate. It could be a lot more accurate than the antibody test, but the antibody tests themselves are increasing. And the third one would be the antigen test, which is another looking for the protein on the virus particle, the antigen, and that's also another test that can be used.
And which tests are the ones that are most commonly used locally?
We can actually do all of them. We can do antigen testing, we can do antibody testing, and we do PCR. We have, as Doctor said, we have 5 PCR machines, and we are using 3 of them at this point. So the standard for diagnosis is the PCR test. The other tests can be used for exposure and to support a diagnosis.
So somebody tests negative today, and on the 5th day, there's a positive test. What accounts for that? And then after that, there's a negative test. How do we explain that? Because I've known
we can explain many of these issues. The first time they may be tested, they may have just caught that infection, and it takes a while to incubate, to really build up steam until it really shows it. The virus is funny in that it adheres to the tissue in the back of the nose, I gotta say this, the back of the tongue, and the lungs. Mm-hmm. And that's why we test in those locations. It can go in a couple of other places, but those 3 places where it loves to go in a simple form. Now, if we just touch tip of the nose here and you send off that test, you may not have taken a proper swab test. It's an improper swab test. Or if you just touch the tip of the tongue, you haven't really tested the right place. And therefore, the test could come back negative when it is really positive. And we call that something of a false negative. Now, as was indicated, there are some tests that, because of the way the test was produced and manufactured, you could also have a false positive test. And what's indicated, what we do here is we do multiple tests. Somebody comes up with a positive, we don't just stop there. We send another test to CAFA, and we also may at some stage also do other tests. And by doing that combination,
The multi-tiered, as it's called?
multi-tiered, we are going to make sure that when we say somebody is positive, they're positive. When we say somebody is negative, they're negative by and large. You know what I mean? And sometimes little mistakes are made, but I think that the vast majority of persons, we want to be accurate when we give them the news. Now, in the meantime, that we find them positive, whether it's a false positive or true positive, we have them under quarantine, and we wait for the next test to come back. We don't take no chances. You understand? We won't take any chances to say, well, go home, go downtown, and next tomorrow, when the test come back, we'll call you, and if it's still positive, we don't do that. We have to act on it very, very quickly. And so you would find somebody on day 5, as you said, we may say it's a positive test. And we evaluate and do another test and find that another one showing, no, it's really negative. And we evaluate. So we want everybody to understand that by doing these multi-tiered, a combination of tests, not often relying on one test, we're able to get a broader, more accurate picture of what is taking place. And I think that is helpful. And really, we want to thank, the Taiwanese, we will thank the folks from the Atomic Energy Unit and from the ministry that eventually bought that machine. That we have 5 tests at one point in time, we didn't have any at all. You know what I mean? But now having 5 machines or 3 in active use, I mean, that's big. And the Venezuelans sharing at that time the rapid tests, antibody tests with us. I mean, those things were your mark. It helped as game changers to what's taking place.
Definitely.
We'll be back after this short break.
Channel 114. Channel 114.
One scratch card, 3 games, 16 chances to win. Win with a top prize of $125,000. Unbelievable but true. It's the new $10 scratch game. $125,000 jackpot. Loaded with lots of cash prizes. $100, $1,000, $10,000, and $125,000. Get your ticket from any lotto agent or scratch runner. $125,000 jackpot. There's cash to catch with just a scratch.
Welcome back. This is our final segment. There's a question, and somebody's saying, coming from the U.S., if they quarantine at the Young Island Hotel, will they be allowed to take early morning sea baths?
Okay. So, as we were saying, so the Young Island is unique in that they're separate villas, and if that person were to just stay by themselves and they slip into the water and they slip back out without any contact with anybody else, that should be fine. I mean, we have also said if you're in your home, if you are quarantining at your home and your house is enclosed, we recommend that you walk around your house and you get your exercise.
And your sun.
And the sun. I mean, so the important thing is not if you don't have to, you would encounter someone else and expose someone else. Generally speaking, we like persons to stay in their rooms, but in a situation where you can just be you and the water back in, that would be okay.
So, Kurt Providence, there you have your answer. Yes, you can have your sea bath once you observe the relevant protocols. One of the things we keep hearing, and repeatedly so, people are saying they're not sick, they don't have any symptoms, so they couldn't be positive. I want us to address this yet again.
You know, very early on, I remember there was a fair amount of discussion, Dr. Keys, Prime Minister, about the percentage of persons who may be asymptomatic. And I think on this program, we also came and said persons may have been pre-symptomatic, may not have had any symptoms yet, or that we missed it. We just missed the symptoms. They could have had a fever and so forth. We still don't quite understand all these particular things. Recent information is we're hearing about kids having a large amount of the virus in the back of their nostrils, but they're smiling. They are not necessarily sick in any way, but it's unclear how transmissible that could be. I bring that up because the answer to your question is still unknown. What makes someone more sick? We know being diabetic, being hypertensive, having underlying illnesses, and so could it. In the United States, in southern states, the amount of people of color, African Americans, and so forth, persons of North American Indians who have gotten sick and died. To see Herman Cain die of COVID-19, to hear about certain other persons who are, people, celebrities, but then the poor man in the streets of some state somewhere or in different parts of the world, Italy, different in Brazil, where housing is just atrocious and people virtually live on top of each other, I think sounds the message that when there is mass overcrowding, when there is mass of people come together, and we got to talk about our mass events and so on, what happens, you see basketball players, baseball players, whole teams coming down with it and so forth. It depends, I think, on how well you might be in the beginning. It depends a lot on many factors that we can't really predict at this point in time. But for sure, if you are diabetic, hypertensive, have heart disease and all those other things, you are at a higher risk of getting very sick and so. So we have a whole hospital, 20-something beds, 28 beds at Argyle, in case anybody gets very sick here in St. Louis area. We've taken care of that. But luckily, I wish nobody ever has to go into that particular hospital. And if persons take it, so I may not have answered your question in terms of what makes somebody very sick and why aren't more Vincentians sick. I tend to say it's largely because maybe of our housing, that we live very much apart and we're separated. We're not living so much in flats and apartments, we're pressing elevators and all that stuff. And we do have some minimal degree of hand washing and so forth. And maybe all those things help in preventing it. But I still say we're not out of the woods. We're not out of danger. And things could turn for the worse if we are not careful enough. And I think that the measures that we have taken have gone a long way in terms of protecting us, but we have to keep them up. And those who say, for persons, just walk off the ship and walk off the plane and all this COVID stuff is a hoax, or was to take some pill that doesn't work, we got to avoid and go against that.
You mentioned two things there, the whole question of mass gatherings and the isolation vis-a-vis the quarantine station at Argyle. And I want to come back to you to talk about the mass gatherings, because I know MC had an awareness session and spoke about the protocols for mass gatherings on the weekend. So I'd ask you about the implementation of that, and I want Dr. Kaiser to talk about the whole question of the isolation center, because people have been saying, well, why don't they use the isolation center? Please explain again, what is the purpose and function of the isolation center at Argyle?
So the isolation center at Argyle is not a regular ward, it's not a hotel. It is a ward, a medical ward that can accommodate somebody who needs respiratory, like breathing help. It can accommodate somebody who is ill. That's the intention. So the intention of the Argyle Isolation Facility was to manage sick persons. However, and this happened recently, so doctor is not aware of it, we actually put 2 persons there, and they're not ill. They are the typical Vincentian COVID positive person who is asymptomatic or no symptoms that we are aware of. They're quite healthy. However, we had concerns about their capacity to maintain the level of isolation, to be compliant with the level of isolation that we would be comfortable with. And so we admitted those two persons there. They had come off of
So they christened the isolation
So they
center?
christened it. We had one person there before, but that person was not a known positive. These persons are known positives, and we admitted 2 persons there, and we discharged 1 after a few days when we had determined that their home situation was such that they could properly isolate at home, and that the person was responsible enough to obey. And the other person is still at the facility. I think we thought it best to keep that person there for their sake and everyone else's. Yes. And that is what so we use the facility for that in this circumstance. But it is not the general use of the facility. It is a hospital, and so we have those 2 persons there, but we have to have staff there. You can't have someone there and not have staff. So, so ideally, we would like persons to be able to isolate or quarantine in their homes. When we realized that was not going to happen, and that's something that's happening throughout the region. I mean, I saw something, I think it was in St. Kitts or BVI recently, that if you want to quarantine at home, you're going to have to pay $6,000 for your own US dollars for yours to pay for a security cost. Yeah. And that security is to ensure that you stay there, and that is for somebody under quarantine. So we made the decision, we have the facility. We were concerned about the capacity to comply with the isolation protocols, and we housed the persons there, and we moved one person when it was appropriate, and the other person is still there.
But as I say, the unit there is also set up to deal with almost like intensive care unit type ventilators and so forth. And I'm glad that nobody has reached that stage where, in relation to your question, they've gotten very sick. In relation to mass
gatherings.
gatherings,
Yes.
well, I'm really pleased that the Medicinal Cannabis Authority held an event in the Post Office, Ministry of Health, Old Treasury Car Park, and discussions with the task force. It was felt that we could do two things at the same time. Not only talk, our main purpose was to talk about cannabis, not so much its use for beneficial purposes only, but also to talk about substance abuse in general. And we wanted to talk not just about cannabis, but also cocaine and alcohol, and talk about even sugar, excessive sugar, all those other things, which are a form of substance abuse. But we said also that we will also talk about COVID and try and show persons what are the protocols that should be in place if anybody's having a mass event. And we've been seeing a number of little mass events around the place, and the protocols are not always being adhered to. So we had our thermometer. Anybody coming in to see the exhibits had their temperature checked. We had them use hand sanitizers. We had a kind of a backpack that we got loaned from the Ministry of Health. One of those spray cans and so forth. Spray the stuff on your hands. People really, people were safe coming through. They got a good dose. Sometimes people spray a little bit of hand sanitizer on your hand, and you don't even think it could go all over. This time we really got their hands really wet, And then they basically had that distancing in terms of coming through. We made sure that they were able to put on masks, and we felt that it was a good example of how, of the proper protocols in having a mass event. We had lots of rain initially and so forth and things like that. And I think the event was well received, the media was there and so forth. But I think the important thing, besides learning about substance abuse, people were able to learn a little bit about COVID in itself and how a mass gathering should be conducted. So if persons were to go to another mass, we wanted to go over to the post office and spray people's hands there too, and go to Flo and Geku and spray people's hands there too. But, things didn't really allow us to do that. But I think that we have to do some of these things. Vincent, we have to get back into some of these protocols. We can't allow this COVID to ever take root here in St. Vincent Grand. And I think that we're really happy that we have some measure of freedom here in St. Vincent Grand. But yes, let's use freedom wisely.
To do the right thing.
To do the right thing.
Well, that's our program for today. Thank you, Dr. Gerald Thompson, infectious disease specialist and, of course, advisor to the COVID task force here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and CMO Dr. Keyser Beach. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you for viewing. Thank you for tuning in. See you again next week, Wednesday. Good evening.